How's it going, everybody? We are starting section 2 of the book Woke Church in our study. This is covering chapters 4 and 5, which Dr. Mason titles this section, Be Willing to Acknowledge. And so when we hear that, we want to ask ourselves, be willing to acknowledge what? In chapter 4, Dr. Mason does a sort of breeze through, a very ambitious project of the American history to uncover or revisit some of the unholy or maybe even painful ways that the church was explicitly and implicitly involved in the history of racism and racialized violence in our country, in our nation's history. And he follows the thread all the way from slavery through to Reconstruction and Jim Crow South segregation all the way to the Civil Rights era. This involvement, the church's involvement in racism in our country, he argues, is something that much of our modern discourse would prefer to either ignore and pretend as if it didn't happen, or maybe distance ourselves from. Now, it's important to note right up front that this isn't some kind of far left ideological dogma that says white people are uniquely evil or that Christianity is inherently racist. Nor is Mason putting forth any anti-American rhetoric. Instead, he frames the conversation from the perspective that we are one big church family around a table, a dinner table, if you remember that metaphor from chapter 3. And he says that it's both harmful and unwise, as we talk about our family issues, to pretend that the past has no effect on our present reality. In fact, he argues that despite the way the gospel was perverted in the past and the way Christians used it to dehumanize, dominate, and disenfranchise black bodies in our country and throughout the European West to exploit blacks, he says that the gospel of Jesus Christ has within it the mechanism of liberation. It's built-in freedom. He says that the truth will always out, if you will. And that even the most disturbing attempts to diminish the gospel will fall short, and they'll be disrupted by the glorious freedom that Paul references in Romans chapter 8. In Mason's own words, he says, the gospel rebels against anything that attempts to stifle its power. And that's really good news in this conversation. Now, I'll admit, though, that this is a very hard and difficult conversation with no easy answers that requires a lot of individual work and research to try to fully understand how the history has shaped our current moment. And this is a journey that I've been on for many years. And it almost feels like a full-time job sometimes trying to figure all of this stuff out. And the journey is full of many emotions and pitfalls and conflict and really times that are unsettling and things you just have to sit with and think through deeply. But that doesn't mean just because it's discomfort causing or that it's uncomfortable that we shy away, right? We have to lean in to this conversation. See, the fact remains that from its inception, the history of transatlantic slavery is literally and inextricably tied to the church. That the unholy union that was created in 1492 when there was a papal bull issued by the Pope of the church that said it was okay to enslave sub-Saharan Africans. The fruit, we're still experiencing fruit from that unholy declaration and unholy union, and you can see it manifest in current issues of racial injustice in our society. Now, this is an ugly truth, it's not pleasant to think about. And while there were certainly white allies and great heroes of the faith who rose along the way to fight racial injustice and who were voices and lights in their time and generation concerning these issues, folks like the Moravians, William Wilberforce, the Quakers, Charles Finney, even Charles Spurgeon, who couldn't go preach in the American South because how strong of a stance he took against slavery that people were threatening to kill and beat and murder him if he came to the South. So while there were certainly lights who arose in their generation to speak out against these issues and to kind of stand for God's truth, they were undeniably the minority, right? That's the hard part. They were undeniably the minority and were themselves often persecuted by a so-called Christian majority. That's the heartbreaking part of this for me, and what Mason says is the heartbreaking part for him, that even though every great society of antiquity was built on free labor, if you think about ancient Rome, ancient Egypt, ancient Chinese dynasties, Islamic caliphates in the Middle East, they were all built on slave labor. The thing that makes Western slavery, and particularly American slavery, different is that we already had the gospel at this time. we need to reckon with the fact that we had the gospel, that we already had an understanding that humanity was made in God's image. We understood Imago Dei and had already begun extending that to as many people as possible, liberating serfs and freeing other Europeans. But there were certain categories of people, Black people, that we didn't express and extend this Imago Dei, this dignity, God-given dignity to. In order to justify chattel slavery in this country, we literally and legally dehumanized Africans, right? We all know that in the Constitution, Africans were considered 3/5 of a human being. Like that, if you think about that, that's like a brain breaker. Now, obviously that's been amended and we've made great strides, but in the process of dehumanizing a group of people that we knew was against our very religion and the very gospel that set us free, and the people who were building our nation, many of them believed in the principles of the gospel. In that process of dehumanizing others, those who approved and allowed such actions ended up dehumanizing themselves. My point is simply this: while there's been immeasurable legal, moral, and cultural gains since the civil rights era, let alone since slavery, the cultural imprints and transmissions, right, that were passed down from generation to generation, the structures built into many of our institutions, and the scars on our souls and psyches, both nationally and on individual families and regions and communities, those things just don't go away. I think we sometimes think, or perhaps we're taught, slavery was this terrible blight on American history, but then Lincoln freed the slaves and it was all good. And then we kind of ignore Reconstruction and how that was legislated against, and the KKK sprung up in that period of time, and Jim Crow and segregation. And we kind of ignore that period of really unrest and evil in our nation's history, participated in by a lot of people who would identify themselves as Christians. And maybe we're familiar with that. And then we say, it was a bad period, but then Dr. Martin Luther King came and got people's civil rights and racism disappeared. And the hard part about that is that there's just so much more to the story. The example that I like to revisit when considering the kind of transgenerational impact of both systemic and personal racism is this. We're all familiar with, we've all seen photos or footage of police in Alabama and in the South sicking German shepherds on little Black girls who were marching for their rights in the 60s, right? We've all seen these images. These are images that got the American people to move in mass and created the critical mass that produced the kind of freedom that we needed in our nation. But just because Lyndon B. Johnson signed a bill, the police officer who is in that photo sicking German shepherds on that little girl, he didn't lose his job, right? He maintained his position of power. And so did so many other people in other institutions that were kind of formulated on these in this way of racism and domination. These people remained in power, continuing to hire folks who reflected their attitudes and actions. They continued to determine how best to apply and manipulate new laws and practices that were designed to establish equality for all. And then they also, on a personal level, continued to raise their children with a certain set of worldviews and values. My own father, who was one of the first handful of children to integrate his elementary school in the 50s in rural southwestern PA, was literally attacked by like a third grader with a bullwhip who was calling him the N-word because my Black father had befriended a little white girl that this other little boy liked. And he thought that was wrong. She shouldn't be talking to him because he was Black. He met him outside after school with a bullwhip. This is third grade, and that's madness, right? Because this little boy learned this from someone. He had a cultural transmission. Somebody passed the way to treat my father, or people who look like my father. They passed that information down to him. Where did he learn that behavior, we have to ask. See, Jesus taught that a little leaven leavens the whole lump, but we must ask, who is the one baking the bread? Now, to be clear, no nation is perfect, right? My opinion, I think it's a fact. We currently live in one of the freest, most diverse nations on the face of the earth and in world history, and I'm thankful for that. I love being an American. Yet we as Christians are called to loyalties deeper than political parties or nationalism or economic interests. And the historical failure of the church to speak truth to power concerning race in this country has hurt our witness in more ways than one. Martin Luther King was aware of this in his letter from a Birmingham jail, in which he wrote this: I must make two honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. Now, part of me, that's a lot, right? But part of me wants to just say Selah and kind of reflect on the ways where this still holds true in our current context, the situations where this rings true and applies today. Now, to be clear and to be honest, I don't have anywhere near all the answers to solving these problems. And I will admit that the problems of today are not the problems of the past. But I do know we're called to zealously pursue truth and live lives of radical love, even when it costs us. And while I'm thankful for the faithful historical figures who risked all in these various eras, they put it all on the line for what was God's plan and what was right and good and true according to the Bible, I am grieved. I'd be lying to say that I'm not grieved that the whole church didn't rise to the occasion and stand in the gap as well. And I guess the thing that I want us to realize as far as the church is concerned is that it benefits none of us to be ignorant of the history and the implications that the church has in racism in our country, nor does it benefit us to revise history in such a way that pretend that the whole church did. Now, here are some questions you can ask yourself and reflect on. How many generations does it take to undo ingrained sinful attitudes and practices? What forces have shaped your own perceptions of blackness and whiteness? How does unlearning negative or harmful cultural transmissions square with the biblical teaching to renew our mind that we might be transformed into the image of Christ? And then lastly, do Dr. King's words still apply to our church culture today? And if so, in what ways? And with what issues? Mason will have more to say on solutions and how to deal with contemporary issues later in the book and in the next section that we'll read for next week. But before we get there, he wants us to simply pause, reflect, and grieve or lament concerning the church's history in this area. Chapter 5 is all about biblical grief and lament, which he calls entering into the experience of brokenness and being honest about it. Mason goes on to list 10 race-related issues for the church to reflect on and lament. Now, while you don't have to agree with each of these items on his list, or you might be more passionate about one than another, a part of our role as believers is to have soft hearts, for our hearts to break over what breaks God's heart. You remember that old song, like, break my heart for what breaks your, like that's what we're called to. So we're gonna talk about some heavy stuff this week and in the weeks to come, but I've done my best in the discussion questions and with the resource list to provide ample resources and guidance for us to implement our own practice of lament this week, for us to simply just take a moment, be vulnerable before God, pause and grieve. And so I'll end with this. Do we have the capacity to grieve with God, to really sit and be unsettled by history, to reflect critically on some of the things and concerns and issues that are raised in these chapters? Do we have the capacity to embrace the discomfort for the sake of developing greater empathy? Before we try to go on to solve every issue and every problem and fix every broken thing or figure out what's right, let's just take a moment and sit and be with God.